Welcome everyone to the latest Makerere history seminar. This is a semi-regular speaker series we have at the Department of History, Archaeology, and Heritage Studies and if you want to know more, you can send me an email or I usually post them on my Twitter feed as well, announcements. And before I announce today's speaker, I just want to sort of acknowledge the situation that we are in here in Uganda. It's been quite a challenging few weeks, and I know it's for everyone here, and so I'm just very grateful for everyone who has been able to join us from Uganda and Kampala right now. We're all just staying inside, and so there's not much else to do, I'm afraid. So thank you. And we're also very grateful to welcome our speaker today, Richard Reid, who is Professor of African History at the University of Oxford. And he is I think he's well known to many of my colleagues. I think this is actually the first time we've met virtually, but he's no stranger to the Department of History, Archaeology, and Heritage Studies here. Among other things, he was involved in what I am told was a wonderful conference in Mukono several years ago, and is the author of a book that, if colleagues are not familiar with, it's really a fantastic overview and sort of rethinking of Ugandan history, published in 2017 by Cambridge University Press, History of Modern Uganda. And his work goes beyond Uganda as well. I know he's written African history textbooks, worked on history of warfare, worked on the Horn of Africa. I mean, the amount of material is really too much to cover. So we're really looking forward to the presentation today. And just a few words on how we'll proceed. Professor Reid will speak for about 45 minutes to 50 minutes, as long as he would like. Our lecturer from the Department of History, my colleague, Dr. Pamela Kanakwa, will be the discussant and offer a few comments. And then afterwards, it will be open questions and discussion. So if you have a question at any point, please you can write it in the chat, or you can raise your hand. And if you'd like me to read the question, I can do that. If you'd like to ask it yourself, that would also be fine. But please do hold your questions until after the discussant has spoken. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Professor Reid and look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Edgar. Thank you very much for the invitation. I understand that this is a really difficult time everywhere, but obviously particularly in Uganda at the moment. I hope everyone can hear me okay. When Edgar invited me to this seminar, I did wrestle for a little while about the topic, and in the end have decided to present something that is forthcoming. This is an essay that will appear, I hope, in the next few months in the American Historical Review. Feedback specifically on this paper is unfortunately rather redundant, but it is part of a larger project. I call it a project. That's actually rather a pretentious term for something I keep picking up and putting down again, and have done for the last 20 years, to be honest. And that is an attempt to rethink Africa's global 19th century. The essay in American Historical Review is really a first attempt at laying out some of the issues, surveying the literature, and exploring possibilities, the possibilities for reframing this particular era, which includes the Scramble, or the moment known as the Scramble. And as I hope will become clear, this is in many ways, the paper is concerned really with going back to the Scramble and asking questions about what it actually meant. And for those of us who have worked in what we term very broadly pre-colonial history, a word that I do not like, but it's there for convenience. The Scramble, the era of partition, sits very much as a kind of big rupture in the middle of modern African history. We all acknowledge it. We believe we know what happens, the course of events, the key narratives. We all teach it in many ways, and we've certainly written about it. So this is really an attempt to problematize the Scramble for Africa. So when I had decided to actually talk to this theme, I immediately, for the last few weeks, I've got rather worried and increasingly nervous because, of course, when you go big like this, you lay yourself open to all sorts of problems, understandable criticisms and so forth. And actually, some of the discussion that I had with an army of peer reviewers of the original essay to the American Historical Review were actually very interesting, because it shows that when you begin to revisit some of these kind of foundational moments really in modern African history, things can be misconstrued, and certainly lots of debates then are opened up. So in many ways, I'm actually returning, I'm showing my age now because I'm returning to the inspiration of my undergraduate days. This paper is really 30 years in the making. It struck me that in the very early 1990s, when I was first introduced to African history, the 19th century looked to me to be extraordinarily transformative, and yet it seemed to be somehow overshadowed by what came after. That includes the Scramble, but obviously the colonial period itself. And that's kind of stayed with me ever since. How can we reframe the 19th century? And that's kind of been, it's been pushed forward a little bit by being in Oxford. And we do a lot of global and imperial teaching. And there are lots of discussions about what is modernity, those deadly debates in graduate seminars, and of course, increasingly, what is early modernity? And it strikes me that there are parts of the world that are included in that, but very rarely Africa. So it's a long time in the making. Some of the things I've been thinking about, and I hope this makes sense. I sometimes think that I write slightly better than I speak, so do bear with me. And of course, this is the kind of paper that doesn't always lend itself to neat summary. So it is concerned with the era of the Scramble, but particularly how that remarkable moment can be understood in relation to the processes of change within Africa in the decades preceding it. And so I'm proposing that the Scramble can be seen in many ways as a culmination of a number of African dynamics, not just a period of rupture emanating from Europe. Actually, when I was beginning to kind of re-engage with a lot of the literature on this, it struck me, in fact, that a number of historians over quite a few decades have been saying quite similar things. That's not to declare that my paper has no originality, but I think we need to kind of own up, and sometimes, you know, there is a bit of going on here. But it strikes me that a lot of the historians who have worked on this, they have not coalesced into a critical mass over the last few decades, and a number of people have said some very interesting things, but it's never kind of moved on into a kind of school of thought. Obviously, when we think about the Scramble, Africa is not alone in the grand sweep of global history in having its internal political and territorial composition influenced by interfering foreigners. That is actually fairly common. But Africa does look distinctive in the apparent scale of the project, It stands in stark contrast from, for example, China or South Asia, regions for which scholars have proposed an early modern moment, a separate path of modernization. But in Africa, there is no apparent, at least comparable early modernity, no great divergence, to refer to that eminent debate. Only violent conquest and the modernity, in inverted commas, and development which occupation was supposed to have initiated. So how can we see the scramble in light of Africa's longer term internal transformation? Why is anything that Africans achieve in the course of the 19th century apparently insufficient to head off partition? Or is that even the right question? Is it possible to award Africans over a somewhat longer term, a longer durée than is normally the case, a more prominent role within what are conventionally regarded as imperial and global forces for change? Just a note on terminology, two issues which we should tackle before I go any further. One is revolutionary. I hope we don't need to get too caught up in the terminology itself, but my premise here is that Africa's long 19th century witnessed remarkable economic and commercial innovation. A range of polities and societies sought to diversify domestic production and both engage with and drive forward global trade. This was an era of violent entrepreneurs who were both cause and effect of an unfolding military revolution. Kings, rebels, warlords alike were conscious of the indelibly intertwined relationship between war and economy, and sought to integrate material and military cultures in pursuit of external expansion and or internal cohesion. So we have a range of political elites, new and old, alternately visionary and opportunistic, and often both, evincing energy, creativity, and purpose as they sought to engage with global forces. They forged new polities or they reformed existing ones. And in many ways, these dynamics were the product of the entanglement of endogenous and exogenous forces, a kind of coalition of external intrusions and internal change. So perhaps, I mean, we can return and we can debate whether this was indeed a revolution, but that is how I have framed a great deal of what is happening across sub-Saharan Africa in the 19th century. The other issue is just to quickly say something about responsibility, because one of the debates that came up when I first submitted the piece to the American Historical Review was the issue of African agency. And of course, once you begin to talk about agency in this kind of context, as one reviewer pointed out, aren't you basically apologizing for European colonialism? You're removing Europeans from the picture and shifting blame, as it were, and responsibility onto Africans. Now, I defended that myself against that charge, I hope fairly robustly, but it is worth pointing out that I am emphatically not suggesting that Africans, that Europeans can in effect claim little responsibility for the scramble. Once on the ground and having gained access to local resources and acquired effective leverage, Europeans acted with brutal efficiency. None of what is proposed here is concerned to diminish European culpability for what must be regarded as one of the largest scale exercises in material exploitation and racial, at times genocidal violence in modern times. What I am proposing is a more nuanced, complex understanding of the relationship between the scramble, the era between the 1880s and the 1900s, broadly defined, and Africans' own achievements and failures over several preceding decades. The partition, the thoroughgoing reformation of Africa was already underway by Africans long before Europeans intervened in pursuit of their own imperial projects. Now, one thing that all of us here are aware of is that the Scramble occupies a dominant narrative place in textbooks, including my own, and survey histories, and it's an inescapable feature to be traversed in the historical landscape. And we see the memorialization of the Scramble beginning in earnest, really, certainly by the time of the First World War, 1920s, 1930s, whether, and again, thinking from a British perspective, in the remembrance of David Livingstone, for example, his moral sacrifice, or moralistic sacrifice, and increasingly, for example, cinematic portrayals of dogged military heroism in the face of various forms of African savagery, so-called. And in France too, the heroization of late 19th century imperial figures has a long history. And we see also within Africa itself, European military intrusion would be recalled in some of the continent's greatest cultural output. Ethiopian paintings of the Battle of Adwa, vivid, relevant of course to Uganda, the vivid Nyoro remembrances of their brutal conquest at the hands of the British. Chinua Achebe's novel, Things Fall Apart, and of course, millions of Africans have lived in quotidian ways with the legal consequences of demarcation. So it's a very dominant feature in the historical landscape. And recently we also have the new Scramble narrative, this time focusing on the Chinese, for example, on India, the Gulf states, Russia, looking for spheres of influence and getting involved. And often when this stuff is reported, it's often reported in very scrambly kind of ways. And I've begun to term this kind of scrambleology. It seems to persist. The tropes are perennial. This is what happens to Africa. It gets scrambled for by avaricious foreigners in partnership with equally venal local agents. So how can we begin to think about the Scramble? And this was the question I set myself in slightly different ways. It seems in recent years that historians of empire and imperialism really dominate the field in this regard. And over the past 30 years or so, give or take, it often seems that anyone wanting to read anything vaguely new about the partition of the continent must dip into what we can broadly call the imperial historiography, which of course has expanded dramatically since the 1990s. Among historians of Africa, however, interest in the Scramble has declined somewhat. And there is certainly very little in the way of what we could term an Africanist interpretation of what happens. It should be noted, of course, that there is no such thing as a theory, and I wouldn't dare to propose a theory that applies right across the continent. That would be foolhardy. But it does often seem that the facts of the Scramble are often taken for granted. Everyone believes they know what happened and they know why it happened. And in fact, there was a senior colleague here who I won't name because we are being recorded. But when I first floated the idea of doing this senior colleague growled at me, "It's been done," which I thought was very interesting in itself. I mean, very few other topics in African history have been done in quite the same way. So interest has diminished to some extent at the Africanist end of the debate. In the paper, which will eventually be published, I do outline a number of historians in recent years who have worked on aspects of the era of partition itself, or the 19th century at least. Stephen Press's book on dubious speculators, Jan Revos's recent study of Congo. Going a little further back, Robin Law's history of Ouida, for example, Stephen Rockwell and his study of Nyamwezi porters, Giacomo Macola on guns in Central Africa, Silke Strickrod's on West African trade. But Africanists have generally shied away from anything that might be construed as a sweeping statement. That is, of course, in many ways, both, I think, the Africanist Academy's strength, but I think also in some ways its weakness, that I think often scholars are afraid to make bold propositions for fear of getting it wrong. I'm now too old to start worrying about whether or not I've got it wrong. I got to thinking about Basil Davidson, who'll be known to many of you. Basil Davidson once boldly proposed that only a longue durée approach to the last 200 years could elucidate Africa's modern development. And that's kind of come to be seen as, you know, when you say that, often people nod wisely. Yes, that's no doubt Basil Davidson was correct, but in many ways it's seen as a somewhat eccentric notion. We don't really know what to do with it in practical terms. Enormously important work, of course, continues to be done on late pre-colonial topics on the 19th century. But the creeping kind of diminishing of interest in Africa's 19th century seems to be indicative of a belief that its consequences are more interesting than what preceded it. And that African agency and experience is more important to chart after 1900 than before or even during the Scramble itself to some extent. So when we think about the nature of Africa's actual 19th century, it's worth noting that, of course, a number of historians over a number of years have argued that the 19th century was in many ways transformative and very important, but that had very little bearing on the Scramble itself. And I quote from Anthony Atmore, who wrote in his essay in the 6th volume of the Cambridge History of Africa, the overall evidence suggests, he said, that the reasons for the partition were shifts in the international balance of power and of trade amongst the European capitalist states, rather than changes within Africa itself. And around the same time, Adu Boahen, great kind of Nigerian scholar, articulated a similar, West African scholar, articulated a similar argument. I believe, he wrote, that the causes of the Scramble can be found not in Africa, but rather in the congruence of the economic as well as the political and social forces operating in Europe during the last 2 or 3 decades of the 19th century. Notably, in that, in Boahen's great book, African Perspectives on Colonialism, he had spent a great deal of time actually arguing that the 19th century was a time of revolution and innovation in Africa. And this was an argument that was also made by the eminent Nigerian historian Godfrey Uzoigwe, who of course was for many years at Makerere. And more recently, we have work by, for example, Olufemi Taiwo, who followed a slightly different but similar path by arguing that the imperial partition actually knocked Africa off its own rapid path toward modernity in the 19th century. These were scholars who pointed toward the 19th century being important, but there's a cutoff point. The ubiquitous circa 1870 to 1880 cutoff point is the point of rupture. So whatever went before that is fascinating, but we now kind of set it aside. Now we have the Scramble. And of course, many eminent historians have argued for precisely that. And to name just one, in, of course, his landmark study of Equatorial Africa, Jan van Sina was in no doubt that the last 2 decades of the 19th century were catastrophic, and that a combination of violence and famine and disease, what he calls a series of novel calamities, destroyed many of the, quote, old ways of life. So the basic thesis that Africa's 19th century was indeed remarkable, but that its accomplishments were subjected to the wrecking ball of imperial partition, was implicitly or explicitly expounded in scholarship over a number of years. It's worth noting that many of the foundational texts of African historical scholarship often had the European partition as their last chapter. I'm sure we can all think of books that ended in circa 1900. And then people moved into the 20th century for different sorts of work. The transformative character of Africa's own 19th century is described in what we can term the classical Africanist scholarship of the 1960s. And again, I return to Basil Davidson, who was unambiguous in his assessment of Africa's 19th century as a time of dramatic innovation and transformation, or at least, and I like this particular quote, the weight of evidence, he said, suggests that the continent was moving toward a large, if slow and diffused reorganization. And again, making the argument that we needed to understand what those transformations meant in order to understand Africa's 20th century. So what was the nature of this reorganization, this crisis? Now, I won't spend too much time running through what is a huge body of literature. And again, this is the kind of writing that doesn't necessarily lend itself to a seminar paper. But just to summarize a couple of key positions, of course, as many, hopefully, I guess all of us are aware, the classic Robinson and Gallagher thesis, the collapse of collaborative regimes on the imperial periphery, whether it was commercial elites in Atlantic Africa or would-be modernizers in Egypt, settlers in Southern Africa. The collapse of those collaborative regimes drew Europeans into the continent, often unwillingly. Now that core idea was picked up by a number of historians of Africa and applied to particular places at particular times. And it was perhaps, in terms of sub-Saharan Africa, it was first really applied to West Africa, the West African coast, of course. Tony Hopkins introduced us to the idea of a crisis of adaptation and the Yoruba Wars of the 19th century, driven by a shift from the export of slaves to the export of palm oil. This traumatic transition diminished the wealth and authority of existing political elites, prompting them to turn to warfare as a means to maintain income and status, which drew the British in. Martin Klein offered a similar interpretation of developments in Senegambia, and work on Dahomey likewise tends to support the crisis of adaptation thesis, even if, as Elise Simoni argued, the kingdom successfully weathered the storm. Now, not everyone accepted Hopkins' crisis of adaptation thesis. David Altis, for example, expressed skepticism about the actual significance of the export trade to most African societies, and argued that, shifts in trade cannot have had such a major impact on the internal functioning of those communities. But other refutations of the commercial strain argument actually serve our purposes in pointing toward the role of African agency. While Hopkins, in essence, was pointing toward the relative weakening of indigenous structures as a result of commercial pressure, others pointed toward the precise opposite, the resilience of African institutions. Ralph Austin, for example, proposed that, in fact, older ruling elites were largely able to dominate new forms of trade, and lots of those entities remained more or less intact and had to be crushed during the Scramble. Gareth Austin finessed the argument in the context of Ashanti, which he argued quite successfully navigated the transition to so-called legitimate commerce. Now, these are all very different interpretations of the impact of overseas commerce, but in fact, in their different ways, they highlight the importance of recognizing 19th century African dynamism, innovation, and a capacity for transformation and adaptation in explaining the Scramble. So then the question is, can this be applied elsewhere? And in Southern Africa, for example, it looks like the demonstration of in extremis of colonial conquest in many ways. And yet, when we go back to some of the work of the 1970s, 1980s, Shula Marx, amongst others, they point toward African dynamics again across Southern Africa, being as significant in explaining the nature and direction of the eventual partition of the region, as important as aggressive European interventions following the discovery of diamonds and gold. The rise of the Zulu state and its various ramifications. Those were forces which created the political and cultural landscape within which European capital later operated. In Southern Africa, you also have the emergence of African Christian converts, the Amakolwa, for example, believers in Zulu, successfully positioning themselves as the intermediaries between African and Western worlds. So even in a region such as Southern Africa, one could make the argument for African forces being at least as important as European dynamics. In other areas, Europeans kind of come into the narrative only at the very end, on the coattails of much more convincing trailblazers and pioneers. I think here again of the Nyamwezi in Central East Africa, where there is a transformation of society between the 1830s and the 1880s, involving both coastal merchants and Nyamwezi entrepreneurs. The result, of course, was the rise of remarkable, if short-lived, states such as those of Marambo and Nyungu Yamawe. My own dear old PhD supervisor, Andrew Roberts, once characterized this with Andrew's characteristic restraint. This progress, he wrote, however illusory, may help to suggest that the local economies were less inflexible and more inventive than is commonly supposed. And I can just imagine Andrew actually saying that. I would go further and point toward a fundamental reordering of African society, economy, and polity. By the time the Germans show up, of course, driven by a different set of dynamics, international rivalries, nation-building exercises in Central Europe. But the consummation of the German colonial project, such as it was only made possible through the use of local agents, soldiers as well as political allies, who were themselves the consequence of the region's transformative 19th century. One could say the same about Ethiopia, an area that I've worked on for a number of years in the context of the 19th century. Ethiopia, of course, as many of you will know, is often seen in terms of exceptionalism. What Ethiopia does doesn't really relate to the rest of Africa. And I've annoyed many very pure Ethiopianists by arguing precisely the opposite. They don't like me for that. And I get accused of simply dabbling in Ethiopian history. Real Ethiopianists don't dabble. That's what I've been told. But actually, Emperor Theodros in the 1850s, 1860s, in many ways, is one of the clearest manifestations of these kinds of dynamics of a 19th century African revolution. Arguably, Emperor Menelik, who of course famously defeated the Italians at the Battle of Adwa, had as great an influence on how Italy turned out as Garibaldi did. Italy in many ways is shaped by its interaction in the Horn of Africa. And just to come to your neck of the woods, or where most of you are at the moment, we don't generally talk about the lacustrine region in terms of a crisis of adaptation. But of course, in the case of Buganda, several decades of commercial expansion and of course from the 1870s missionary work had heightened tensions at the royal court, changing patterns of social aspiration, expectation and consumption, and rendering the kingdom particularly volatile as its global interactions intensify. Some of these stresses and strains predated the era of direct global contact. The Ganda state, after all, was built on and was the product of creative tension at its center. But they were dramatically exacerbated in the second half of the 19th century. And the Buganda kingdom provides one of the finest exemplars of empire making in situ in the region itself. And this has often been something that has intrigued me. Again, as I mentioned earlier, lots of these dynamics tend to be reduced to a sentence or two in the big imperial works on British imperialism, for example. But what I'm increasingly drawn to is the question of how does empire actually get made in particular local areas. So this has prompted, of course, many to characterize Buganda as exemplifying a sub-imperialism. And there's a striking parallel here, in fact, with Nigeria, where Hausa sub-imperialists grasped the opportunities presented by the British to gain considerable power over the peoples of the Middle Belt of Nigeria, as Moses Ochonu has recently demonstrated in his terrific book, Colonialism by Proxy. Now we need to pause here just for a second and remind ourselves that while Buganda may be said to have successfully co-opted the British, there were societies for which this was demonstrably not the case. And in the Ugandan context, Bunyoro, for example, which of course is decimated by an Anglo-Uganda invasion. So in other words, in discerning successful dynamic instances of how Africans co-opted Europeans into their own conflicts and their own ambition, we are simultaneously identifying groups and communities which were the victims of that co-option. It's very important to flag this out. Bunyoro's experience in the 1890s sat toward the far end of a spectrum along which the experience of imperial violence may be measured. Even further along, of course, were the Nama and Herero. In these circumstances, the brute force of Europeans was the product of a peculiarly toxic, dehumanizing military culture, as Isabel Hull has argued for the German Second Reich. And African auxiliaries were caught up in the destruction that's ensued. Actions against the Shona, the Ndebele, serve as another stark representation of this level of violence. The Ngoni in modern-day Zambia, and again, going back to Jan van Sina, equatorial Africans decimated by colonial violence. This was European colonial war in extreme. But in many other situations, Europeans had few other options open to them than to take advantage of the turmoil and the fission wrought by the events of the 19th century. This is evident in Central and Eastern Congo, for example, where the slave and ivory trades and resultant political and commercial developments over the second half of the 19th century created the environment for violent intervention by Belgians and their local proxies. The notorious force publique was made possible through the recruitment of the displaced and formerly enslaved, but in many ways entrepreneurial and brutalized communities, which were the product of a commercial revolution over several decades. The question of recruitment, of course, is key to this. Recruitment into late 19th century colonial armies, so often framed, I think, in colonial-centric terms as the beginning of something, in fact represented the culmination of decades of demographic ebb and flow, and of the evolving fissures and frontiers within and at the edge of expanding and contracting polities. This is evident in French recruitment strategies in West Africa, including the Tirailleurs Senegalais. We can identify this similar dynamic in the Eritrean highlands as well, where the Italians recruited men from across a turbulent plateau as Askari. But in many ways, the Italians were simply the latest group of actors to involve themselves in this kind of region, and the latest opportunity for men, as men they mostly were, for a life at arms and material improvement. The Portuguese, in what would become Angola and Mozambique, laid the foundations of their colonies by essentially co-opting local wars and armed entrepreneurialism, which had their roots in the long 19th century. As the Germans demonstrated in Southwest Africa, and as the British did in Uganda and the Rhodesians, imperial violence could and did unfold in unfettered, racialized, destructive fashion. But co-option by Africans was common, as was the local opportunism, which was the product of those very same fissures and insurgencies spanning several decades. In the paper, I do then propose a kind of comparison of Africa and Europe. Perhaps I'll skim over that for the moment, but it's kind of worth floating the idea that in fact lots of the things that are occurring in Europe at this time, politically and economically, do have their mirror in Africa itself, and the comparison is perhaps more relevant than we might initially think. But let me move towards some kind of conclusion. What happened to these histories of entrepreneurialism and dynamism within Africa during the 19th century? A steady process of foreshortening and an increasingly presentist, I think, interpretation of the continent's in inverted commas condition, somewhat through Africa's dramatic 19th century into shade. The late pre-colonial moment in some ways became framed as an exercise in failed modernity. This was its kind of prelude, its pre-dawn. Africans sitting rather glumly in Chakrabarty's waiting room of history. And various figures like Theodros in Ethiopia, like Mirambo among the Nyamwezi, look in some ways like the warm-up acts for colonial modernity. Various groups, of course, had a vested interest in the perpetuation of these narratives, most obviously in Europe itself, Europe's own narrative, its self-image, and reflected an enduring pride in the supposed essential benevolence of empire and the civilizing mission, the righteousness of European violence. And those of us who thought that maybe those views had been consigned to history have since been reminded, of course, at least in these sorry little islands, that in fact these ideas of the essential benevolence of empire are still very live. Witness the kind of ongoing disputes around Cecil Rhodes' statue just a few streets from me here. But this wasn't only a question of European amnesia or a European framing of the 19th century. By the time the OAU was signing off its inaugural charter, the era of partition had become the foundation stone of modern African nationhood. It was an almost sacrosanct pivot, a rupture, a beginning, and an underpinning. I've written about this elsewhere, but in very brief terms, mid-20th century nationalists, including Julius Nyerere, for example, in Tanzania, made occasional forays into the 19th century in search of heroes, models and inspirations. But increasingly, there was a great deal of nervousness about what the pre-colonial represented, and nationalist projects were at best ambivalent about the 19th century and ambivalent about what had preceded the Scramble. This was not, in other words, regarded as a golden age. And I'm very struck by the fact that the great political scientist, primarily political scientist Thomas Hodgkin, who observed in the mid-1960s that it was ironic that the very revolutionary upstart nature of Africa's politics in the 19th century should have offered models of reform and initiative. Instead, they conjured up images of violent turmoil and instability and made nationalists rather nervous as a result. And of course, the idea of the Scramble as an overwhelming European conquest did enable nationalists to build ideas about national renewal and lend itself to resist ideas of heroic resistance. But in a curious way, the upshot of this was the prolongation of Dark Continent mythology, and actually what the 19th century had represented. And in many ways, this view of Africa's 19th century, for example, stands in stark juxtaposition with the British obsession in later decades of the 20th century with all things Victorian. Similar views are not prevalent in the African context. So what are the possibilities for revisionist histories, reframing Africa's global 19th century? And here is where I think any project that seeks to do this is, we find ourselves kind of picking up arguments made by historians and then kind of set down as the field sort of moved on. In the very first issue, I'm pretty sure it was the very first issue of the Journal of African History in 1960, John Hargreaves wondered whether a more prominent role could not be identified for Africans in the Scramble. And a few years later, the political scientist Sadia Tuvel explored the African input into the making of borders and treaties on the ground, for example. Many others would return to this basic idea. Ronald Robinson himself went on to challenge the prevailing Afrocentricity of many interpretations, the standard accounts of the Scramble, by proposing a theory of collaboration. David Fieldhouse, again, argued that too much emphasis had been placed on the center to the detriment of a more nuanced understanding of the periphery. Elsewhere, we can draw inspiration, I think, from historians such as Sharman, who argued that there is something of a myth in the early modern period of European military superiority. And in fact, the only way that early modern empires worked, particularly in South and East Asia, was through a concoction of local alliances, as well as a very generous dollop of good fortune. In recent years, there's been some attention paid to the African personnel whose involvement in the colonial order enabled that very order to function. Work on African military personnel, I think that we still have a long way to go on that. There's been some wonderful work done by, for example, Michelle Moyd, her book Violent Intermediaries. The question of the extent to which those Africans caught up in colonial armies, or certainly constituting the majority of colonial armies, how much agency they have been awarded in the Scramble itself is perhaps questionable. But I think that the African intermediaries angle is one potential route, and hopefully one that will offer us more answers into how the Scramble actually panned out and how that is related to what went on in the decades preceding it. So in conclusion, the argument really of the paper, which I hope has somehow come across in the last few moments, is that Africa's 19th century did witness transformations in economy and political form, in the practice and culture of war, in social order. Africans, of course, find themselves in a globally exploitative economic system and up against European powers, of course, with greater material resource at their disposal. But this does not negate African efforts to innovate, reform, diversify, and develop. And we don't have to deny the horrors of colonial violence to recognize the vigor of local agency. So going back to something I said at the very start, which is, where does Africa fit in these kind of global histories and histories of modernity that have brought East Asia and South Asia into their orbit? The Scramble was not the outcome of Africa's falling behind or of its failed modernity, but of a tumultuous, dynamic process of global engagement. And what I'm seeking to do is position Africa more firmly in those imperial and global scholarly frameworks. The African Revolution, in many ways, was not derailed by the Scramble, it culminated in it. I think I'll leave it there, Edgar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that presentation, and we're looking forward to the discussion. Well, just for those who've come in a bit late, we will next move to a comment from Dr. Pamela Kanakwa. And following that, there will be questions, which you can either put them in the chat or use the raise hand function. So with that, I will hand over to Dr. Kanakwa.
Hey, thank you very much, Edgar, and thank you, Richard, for the fantastic paper. I don't think I'm even qualified to comment on it because it is it's a work well done and really, really well polished. That said, because I have to give some comments, I'll try to ask some of the things that came across my mind as I read the paper and also listened to you speak. Of course, just looking at the title, I thought, okay, so what is new? And so I think the senior colleague that asked you that question might have not been the only person to ask what is new about the Scramble, and what should we expect. And so it made me think about sort of statements that my colleagues make about anybody intending to, study Buganda. And we have senior colleagues in the department who keep saying, what is new about Buganda? Buganda has been over-researched. There's really nothing new about Buganda. But that said, anyway, so I went ahead and read the paper and I found it really, really interesting. And one of the things that struck my mind was the question of African agency, which, of course, as you state very clearly, that we need at least to establish some degree of local responsibility or Africa's responsibility in this Scramble. And I think before I read further than that, again, what struck my mind was the concerns of African historians early in the 50s and 60s that, they didn't want to just study a history of European activities in Africa, but, they really wanted African history where Africans were present, where there was African agency. And then I thought, okay, so this question of African agency here, where does it take us? Does Richard want us to think about the role of the Africans? Does this resonate with the Thornton's argument about the role of Africans in the Atlantic slave trade, or what was it? And so I sort of have a question about the whole idea of awarding Africans a more prominent role, kind of vis-a-vis African agency. And my question, I think, is, the question that this paper got me thinking about is, what is African agency? What is African agency? And at what point do Africans' actions or choices constitute their agency in subsequent historical development or whichever? Because if we look at the dynamism of the 19th century, as you well laid out, in the subsequent partition, and also if we take the point that either way the partition was already underway anyway, which of course makes sense, especially looking at the various forms of engagement between Africans and whether they were European merchants or traders along the coast, the forms of interactions that were there, and how those fueled the sort of, again, developments within Africa, whether they're military innovations or whether there are commercial transformations and all that. And so I guess my question is, consciously, when all the things happen in the 19th century, Africans are engaged in them, but then how does that, excuse me, how does that play into the partition, the dynamism of the 19th century, Africans sort of consciously doing whatever they do? Are they engaged in these different revolutions or activities, well aware that this will shape subsequent developments? Or is it that, as one could say, maybe they are involved in their own sorts of activities, but that somehow along the way colonization comes in anyway, and they don't have the ability to stop the partition. So I think for me it's just to what extent would we say that their activities consciously, the Africans consciously, in their different activities during the 19th century actually have a role or play a role in the partition? And so I would have wanted you, I would like you maybe to sort of help me make that clear, so that I don't misunderstand, so that I don't misunderstand you. And then also about the point about the partition, about the role of the OAU and the idea of the borders, the creation of the borders, or the recognition of those borders, and the call for the respect of territorial integrity of borders and all that. I think I would have wanted to hear again a little bit. Of course, in my sense is that by the OAU doing that, they're actually reaffirming the partition that had taken place much earlier. But then, so where does that? So do we see their agency there in saying this is okay, we take it? Do we, just in terms of drawing the connection there, I think I would have wanted to hear a little bit more, especially that you have this in the introduction and bring us back to it. But I think you don't talk to the question of the borders so much, in looking at the issue of African agency and responsibility. Where is it in connection to the partition, and what is subsequently affirmed because I see the OA more as affirming than maybe seeking to decolonize, which, as you've already said, is kind of a common talk. So yes, of course, lastly, and I think this is just all of us, how then does awarding Africans a role in this scramble change the way or shape the way that we think, or we might want to talk about European colonization of Africa? I think I'll stop there for now. Over to you, Edgar.
Thank you very much, Pamela, for those comments. And I think between the presentation and those comments, there's a lot on the table. Richard, would you like to respond first, or would you rather open up to discussion? Up to you.
Maybe I'll just take a couple of Pamela's points, because thanks, Pamela. Those were really crucial questions. There are people on this call who will no doubt be able to kind of offer ideas about what is agency, and it certainly is something that we wrestle with in teaching global history, for example. When is someone exercising agency, and when are they not? and when are they kind of being caught up in a series of currents over which they have no control. And I think this is really an attempt to offer a slightly more nuanced understanding of what agency is. I mean, I often ask my own students, do you believe you have any agency over your own life, for example? And some of the more naive ones will say, yes, absolutely. But that's maybe me just getting old. In terms of African agency particularly, I mean, obviously there's a huge literature on this. And if you think about the Atlantic world, and you mentioned the slave trade, Pamela, and I actually do talk a little bit about the slave trade, because of course this is a huge part, if we want to be longue durée about this, the idea of African agency needs to be understood in connection with the slave trade itself. And here I kind of point to the idea developed, I guess, by people like John Thornton and Paul Gilroy in his sort of seminal study, The Black Atlantic, which would argue that African agency was crucial in shaping the Atlantic world. This is not to say, of course, that it's a very different thing from pointing out the iniquity of the slave trade itself, but that the Atlantic world becomes an arena of interaction and cultural influence and so forth, and the emergence of an African-American and Atlantic identity, which is shaped by Africans themselves. When we think about partition, your question of whether people were conscious, I'm not really. I mean, you can actually ask the same thing about Europeans. Were Europeans conscious what they were actually doing in the period of partition? And obviously the answer is no. Africans were not conscious in terms of did they foresaw what the colonial order, for example, that was coming. I guess my point is more that the operation of partition itself, those very early foundations of the colonial order, colonial orders, could not be realized without African input. And of course, people are acting very much at a local level. They're acting according to local dynamics. They're also behaving in ways, and I guess this is what the paper kind of driving at, that their behaviors are rooted in many of the events of the long 19th century. The political Reformation going on across many parts of the continent, new opportunities for global engagement. The partition, it offers another, or what we later call the partition as a kind of discrete unit of time, offers similar kinds of opportunities to many of the communities that I mentioned. And in terms of the, I didn't quite catch the question around the OAU, but of course it's worth sort of noting, and again, those of you who have worked on the 1950s, 1960s know this very well, that there are various options obviously open to nationalists in the mid-20th century. As far as an African international order is concerned, the acceptance of colonial boundaries in the founding charter of 1963 is clearly a moment which awards the period of partition a particular significance. There is a decision taken that territorial arrangement is something with which African governments will work. I think the moment is a lot more ambiguous than simply that acceptance would suggest, because even, of course, throughout that period, then there are, as I mentioned, a number of nationalist movements, independent governments looking backward into the 19th century, looking backward into the pre-colonial past, wondering what they might do with those histories, and in many, if not most cases, deciding, in fact, that there's not enough there that they can use, or that the models offered by reformist movements of the 19th century, various insurgencies and examples of innovation, don't provide the kind of models that modern nation states need. So, you know, there is in the acceptance of the colonial of the order brought about by partition, there's a great deal of agency being asserted. There's a very conscious decision being taken to accept a particular view of the past. Perhaps I'll stop there, Edgar, and open it up.
Thank you very much. So, so we have a few questions already coming forward. First, in the chat is one from Nicholas Tunanuche. Nicholas, if you'd like to read it yourself, you can unmute. Otherwise, I can read what you put here. And it's a question about moral economy. And I suppose that raises a question about also about going back to other previous schools, the way Marxist scholars and dependency scholars would have said there was a rupture. There used to be history of Africa, and now there is, I forget the distinction, but history that there was a rupture that changed the context of agency in a way that was made it categorically different in, say, 1890 than it was in 1850. Nicholas, are you here? If not, there's also, I saw Moses. We can take, what I'd like to do is take maybe 2 or 3 questions at a time, and then allow you to address them as a group. So I saw that Moses Kisa had your hand raised. I don't know if you still.
Yes.
Oh, there you go.
And actually, I have just a minute or two to have to run, but I was now typing the question in the chat. But yeah, thanks Edgar for organizing this, and thanks to Richard for a brilliant take on a very complex subject. I was curious, and I don't know whether I'll stay around to hear what Richard has to say about my question. I was curious, Richard, to know what you have to say about the role of domestic state formation processes in shaping the eventual cartographic demarcations that happened at the time of border making during partition. Sort of touches on the question that Pamela was raising earlier. And as a political scientist, I'm interested in, how the existing and ongoing state building, state making processes actually had something to do with the way borders were eventually made at the time of partition.
Thank you, Moses. I have a queue here of about 6 people. I think we'll take 2 more. First, Nicholas, are you able to unmute? And did you want to ask your question? Go ahead. Okay, in that case, I see there's. Go ahead. Okay, so maybe.
Thank you, Dr. Edgar, for this. And the question is already in the chat.
Fantastic. So I think.
I was just. Hello, Edgar.
Hello, go ahead.
Yeah.
I think maybe you can
how the concept of moral economy is actually relevant in explaining the European interest and the African
sorry, it looks maybe there's a technical issue. But I think we have the general idea. So thank you, Nicholas. Next.
You Professor Reid relate the moral economy
Sorry, Nicholas, it seems there's a connection problem. Sorry about that. Next, Liz, there's a question from Dr. DePio. Would you like to unmute? She said that, oh, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, Edgar. And mine is, really also something more of a comment about the issue of African agency. I'm just wondering, during the partition or colonialism, did they have that much of agency? And the fact that the agenda of colonialism was already drawn, right, from Europe, and whatever it was, even when they came in the name of engaging the Africans in trade or whatever, they had a pretty clear agenda, I believe, of where this partition was going. So the Africans, in my view, perhaps were treated as people to engage with, so that whatever the interaction was will lead in the direction of their end, which is really the partition. So since they were not at the table in Berlin, they quite didn't know what was happening. I would like to think like that. And so it was very easy to get them into this play with some immediate benefits coming to them in the process. And so it becomes very difficult to imagine what sort of agency that will be, because it's like the treatment was not like of partners in that sense. That was my kind of comment plus question. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So if we could take one more question from Adventino Bandwa, and then we're going to take another round. And I have in the queue for the next round of questions, Agatha Alidri, Arthur George Kamya, Derek Peterson, and Yusuf Kasumba. So, but if Adventino Bandwa, if you would like to pose your question, you put in the chat one about the contemporary political implications for rethinking of agency and the partition.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Am I audible enough?
Yes, yeah. Thank you.
I think my question, you have well summarized it. I simply want Professor Reid to elaborate more on the contemporary political implications of his theory of agency, and maybe to add a little bit on this. As we all know, any theorization of agency goes hand in hand with a particular understanding of power. Maybe this should be my second question. So what then is your understanding of colonial power, Professor Reid, given your revisionist theorization of African agency? Thank you so much for this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. So that's quite a few questions on the table, and then if you'd like to respond, then we'll take the next round after you're done.
Okay. Yes, thanks very much for those. I didn't quite catch. If you don't mind, I might set aside for the moment the moral economy question. I wasn't quite clear what was being asked, and we might be able to come back to that. Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest challenges of presenting a paper like this is that it unleashes all sorts of huge questions, which you suddenly think, not really equipped to answer that, or I hadn't thought that through. But this is the whole fun of the project. I mean, in terms of indigenous local state formation, I think I'd be less interested in the impact of that in terms of borders, but certainly in terms of the shaping of colonial territories. And it is it's quite interesting that, again, understandably and for very good reasons, our focus tends to be on the outcome of the Scramble for Africa, so the actual shape of these nations. As I try to argue in the Uganda book, actually, that Edgar mentioned at the start, there's no question that when Uganda is a curious outcome of a whole set of border making mechanisms and demarcations and shifts in boundaries in the 1920s and so forth. And from that point of view, it looks pretty artificial. And yet in other ways, taking a more nuanced view, Uganda very much makes sense. And this was the kind of argument of the Uganda book. It makes a lot more sense than one would assume. And so the argument here is less around the precision of boundary demarcation, although, as I mentioned, Sadia Tuval did make that case in around 1966, in fact, arguing that maybe we need to look at this a little more closely, to look at how particular African actors influenced boundary making in the 1890s, 1900s. But there's no doubt that for me, one of the biggest issues in Africa's 19th century is the recurrence of insurgencies. These often lead, I've often kind of characterized these in terms of greenfield and brownfield. In some cases, these are insurgencies which happen within existing states, seeking to reform or rejuvenate those states. In other cases, they lead, as in, for example, the Sokoto Caliphate or the Zulu state. They happen on greenfield sites, and they build completely new political systems, and those are political dynamics and their influence on how colonial boundaries and colonial territories are shaped is, I think, profound, because depending on where borders end up, it's those dynamics which are deeply rooted in African political culture and which fundamentally shape colonial territories, which I think is the thing to focus on here. And I think again, it's trying to kind of flip historiographical interests around a little bit. There's an enormous industry focused on various forms of guerrilla movements and what we broadly term insurgencies, rebel movements, and so on since the 1960s, 1970s. And one of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of Africa's global 19th century is how deeply rooted is this culture of insurgency, and how does it actually influence the shape of African territories, colonial territories included. And I think that is a profoundly important dynamic, and it's something that's worth kind of floating. Again, moving beyond the idea that insurgency is a post-colonial malaise, a symptom of some kind of post-colonial failure, and thinking about it as an act of creativity, albeit very violent creativity, that is rooted in the 19th century. So it's those dynamics and their influence on colonial territories rather than simply precise boundaries that would be of concern here, I think. I hope to some degree that addresses the at least some of that question. And the question of, where is the agency in colonialism? And honestly, you could easily make the case for saying, look, there is obviously no African agency here. Europeans have better weapons, although that, of course, is often disputed when you actually drill down and look at the data. I think the questioner kind of suggested that Europeans are broadly leading this process. They know where they're going. If you buy into that interpretation, and of course, quite right, the African representation, there is none at Berlin in 1884-85. This is more a question of Europeans imagining various forms of colonial empire. But the reality is a profound reliance on local forces and having to take advantage, even unwittingly being drawn into local conflicts, local political dynamics, and cultures of, for example, labor movement or cultures of insurgency that I mentioned earlier. To me, that is as important an element in thinking about African agency as thinking about how Europeans are kind of painting colors on a map. And this is, as I mentioned earlier, this is really trying to get at how empire actually gets made in Africa at this moment. That's really what this is about. The colonial order cannot function without the soldiers which it recruits in this period. And many of these soldiers are, of course, conscripted, but in many cases, there are signs that this is a continuation of an armed entrepreneurialism, which actually dates back into the deeper 19th century. And again, that's the kind of thing that I'm keen to look at. Again, it's not to say, of course, that there are often larger forces at work, ultimately over which Africans have no control. I mean, sheer kind of geographical vision and geographical knowledge in itself would suggest as much. But it's really kind of looking at local examples of how African dynamics shape the nature of conquest, of European conquest. And again, idea of lack of partnership. I mean, of course, Uganda, again, offers us a very good example of this. I mean, Pamela pointed out that why do people come and study Buganda? There's nothing more that's new to be said about Buganda. One of the things that people keep telling me, and have told me for the last 25 years, that Buganda was never it was never conquered. Buganda was a partner to the British. Buganda was not actually consumed within the colonial project in the same way, for example, that Bunyoro was. And I think there are questions about local alliances, as is the same argument's been made for the early modern empires, for example, in South Asia and Southeast Asia, that actually those are the dynamics, those are the agencies that we should be looking at, not subsequent narratives of overarching conquest and what looks pink on a map, for example. And the final question there was about the contemporary political implications. I wasn't expecting that, I must say. I'm not sure I know how to answer that. I would return, I think, to someone like Thomas Hodgkin, who was also writing about these things in the mid 1960s, suggesting, that if you wanted models of reformation and innovation and so forth, the 19th century is the place to go, and it offers lots of very useful examples of reformism and social mobility, for example. In a sense, the arguments around decolonizing, for example, I think are relevant here. It often strikes me that decoloniality or decolonial agenda often doesn't reveal particularly nice results always. It's not, this is not the kind of decolonial cleanliness that one would perhaps like to see. There's plenty of coercion, there's plenty of violence in this episode of African history. But there is plenty there to kind of allow us to think about the ways in which Africans have historically responded to global opportunities and have sought internal rejuvenation and have sought to kind of capture external relationships to their own advantage. I suppose ultimately the second part of that double-hander was the nature of colonial power. And I suppose, I mean, I've never really been a historian of colonialism. I've left that to others. I do, however, I've long wondered just how stable colonial power actually is. And I think that this is an attempt by kind of drawing some of these discussions back into the 19th century. I'm questioning the expedient and contingent nature of colonial rule. Let me leave that there.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful, I think. We have I have 7 names in the queue. I think we have enough time for 2 more rounds if people can pose their questions briefly. I saw that Agatha Alidri had her hand raised, but but has put it down. Would you like to ask a question, Dr. Alidri?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Edgar, and thank you, Professor Reid, for the presentation. It's a very mind-intriguing presentation. It raised a number of questions. One, does awarding Africans a prominent role in the Scramble make any contribution to the knowledge on the Scramble? And I would like to say, to me, awarding African prominence sounds like vindicating the Europeans of their role in the Scramble for Africa. I was trying to read your mind. And then secondly, was the African agency circumstantial or consciously done? What was the power relations between the African agent and the European colonial agents? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Agatha. Important question about consciousness there. Arthur George Kamya, would you like to?
Thank you very much, Edgar, and thank you, Professor Reid. I guess I'm one of the few Americanists here, although I'm Ugandan. Sort of the paper brings to my mind sort of recent historiographical moves in American settler colonialism. You know, I'm thinking here, Richard White's Middle Ground, or Pekka Himalayan sort of Comanche Empire, and this idea that sort of European imperialism was not a one-sided contest. That essentially involved negotiation, exchange, balance. But I think to get there, at least the Americanists have had to move away from sort of high politics, from high economics, from boundaries, to think about sort of, attenuated sort of networks of exchange, ideas, practices, and things like material culture become very important. So I don't know, I mean, is this maybe another way of trying to rethink, this idea, sort of maybe, dampening down a little bit sort of this question, talk about sort of boundaries and militaries and sort of focusing on sort of the things that people are trading locally and the ideas and practices that are sort of being networked, in local networks. So thanks.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Next, Derek Peterson has a question in the chat. Derek, would you like to pose it verbally?
I don't need to say much besides what's in the chat, Edgar. Thank you. But just briefly to say that I think many of us would be interested, Richard, to hear your thoughts on the experience of minoritization among and within African communities that are enclosed in colonial boundaries. So think, for example, of the Bakonzo in the Rwenzoris, or the Banyoro in Mubende County, or any number of other folks who found themselves subject to foreign aristocracies that were reinforced during the scramble for Africa by British colonial power. That strikes me as an engine, as I said in the chat, for the creation of critical historiographies that looked at colonial government not solely as an exercise in European rule, but as a kind of elevation of unwarranted African authority over minority groups.
Thank you, Derek. The next is from Yusuf Kasumba, but I think it's very similar to the question posed earlier about contemporary implications, which is there in the chat. Yusuf, would you be able to briefly elaborate on that, and then Professor Reid can respond? Hello, Yusuf.
Edgar, maybe you got somebody else and we wait.
Yeah, so it seems that maybe a connection problem. So Professor Reid, if you'd like to respond, we'll then go in the next round of questions. I have David Ngendo, Zaid Sakito, and Christopher Mahosi. So if you'd like to take what's there,
yeah. Okay, so thanks for those. I'll in order. So the idea of this being a kind of sort of apologia for European colonial rule. As I kind of suggested at the start, it is absolutely not that. There's no question that, and this is the reason why I brought in the idea of responsibility stroke agency at the beginning, to precisely try to kind of head off this. So it's useful to kind of reiterate. It is understandable that, of course, once you begin to try to complicate or problematize established narratives in this direction, it looks as though you're saying, well, these guys weren't really to blame. It was actually it was complicated because you've got these other actors and so forth. But I mean, it's, in a sense, that's exactly what I'm saying. As I pointed out, this is absolutely not to suggest that there wasn't extraordinary brutality and violence in extremis in the period between the 1880s and the First World War on the part of Europeans. The examples I cited in the paper itself are just a very small sample of that kind of violence. It is absolutely not to do with somehow kind of exonerating Europeans. What I think is more interesting to me is getting to grips with the late pre-colonial moment for Africa. It's that period between, say, the 1790s and the 1890s, however we want to kind of define it, and the ways that Africa is imposing, or a range of African societies are imposing themselves on global forces and shaping those global forces in often quite violent ways. And this will, in some ways, comes back to Derek's point, which I'll come back to in a moment. It's trying to mess up those established conquest narratives. And it's in some ways driven by, again, a lot of work I've done tangentially on early modern European empires, for example, in South Asia, reading that kind of literature. It strikes me that often historians of India and Southeast Asia are able now to complicate the picture of what European empire actually looked like, how it functioned, the sorts of dynamics with which it interacted in ways that haven't really yet happened in terms of 19th century Africa. And here again, I'm thinking more about what Africans are achieving before the Scramble. And in fact, in some ways, focusing in on the Scramble itself is to some extent is actually a kind of distraction. What I'm really trying to do is think about what is happening in the continent that is relevant to what happens in the 1880s and 1890s. It's not at all, again, to exonerate Europeans or to kind of get Africans to carry their share of the burden of blame. It is, however, to kind of look at how empires actually get made, and they get made as a result of extraordinary dynamics at the edge, at the point of global interaction, of global exchange, and that's really what I'm seeking to do. And there may not be the macro level consciousness, and this goes back to a question that Pamela asked earlier, on the part of African actors, but Europeans are constantly being shaped by those interactions at the periphery, even during the period of high conquest, which of course, bearing in mind, cannot happen without African recruits in colonial armies. To the point about getting away from high politics, I could not agree more strongly, and I think that was this is a terrific point, and this is why, in some ways, it's great to hear that example from the Americanist Academy, because often we do. Sometimes it's good to kind of look beyond sub-Saharan Africa itself and see what other people are doing. And here, I think networks, exchange, interactions at the cultural frontier, if you like, are in some ways much more interesting than high politics. One of the reasons that, apart from there being a global pandemic, of course, that I keep putting this book project on, and getting slightly fed up with it, is because one ends up being drawn back to the high politics, which kind of dominates the historiography. The politics is clearly hugely important, the rise and fall of states, the expansion and contraction of particular types of insurgent movement in the 19th century. But I think, to your point about getting away from that, this is exactly the kind of inspiration I'm looking for, and any pointers that you might have in that direction for me to look at in the American world would be gratefully received. I think it is key to look beyond. To give one example, the fall of the Oyo Empire, or Dahome's. The Kingdom of Dahome's dealings with European diplomats or Brazilian traders, but try to drill down into what is actually happening on a more kind of quotidian level. But those are often those little shifts, those movements, often representative of social mobility, are actually kind of much more interesting than what is happening through the long 19th century. So I absolutely accept that. And to Derek's point about minorities within colonial boundaries, yes, of course. I mean, this is what ends up happening, is that people are enclosed within territories which are dominated by a particular majority or a particular dominant group. I guess one thing that's worth pointing out, though, is that this is not actually novel in the early 20th century. That kind of sense of colonial enclosure, in some ways, in some cases, may exacerbate that particular issue. But again, going back to my point earlier about the desire for decolonial cleanliness, the fact is that the 19th century is also a very messy period in which we see the dominance of particular groups over smaller minorities. This is an era of coercion. of course, expanding slavery, of course, within the continent itself, but also again, there are many examples, particularly from West Africa, that spring to mind immediately, where dominant groups feed off minorities on their edges or just within their expanding boundaries. So this is actually a longer term issue rather than simply one of colonial enclosure. Although, of course, clearly what happens as a result of the partition is that it institutionalizes those cultures of persecution of minorities. But the central dynamic is there really from the period of the late 18th century onwards, I would argue.
Thank you. So just to warn you, there's a caravan of children outside my window, so I may not be audible in a second. But thank you. I think we have about 15 minutes remaining and 3 more questions on the table. David, would you be able to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Edgar. I want to thank Richard also for this. I would think it's a very daring move. And every daring move is a very risky move in the historiography, which is dominated by kind of, as we'll say, high politics, and everything has been cast in stones in terms of what we can understand from the 19th century. I have a comment though, I have one comment just before I can ask my question. I think the question has come back again and again on the African agency. And I think the material which Richard is presenting to us, in a way, tells us that agency is also, particularly 19th century agency we are talking about, African agency is historically produced. And because agency is not ontologically out there, but it is rather an historically produced, very much circumstantial thing, we can theorize agency in this tumultuous 19th century dynamism as something of a modern one-way traffic, perhaps more than one-way traffic. That's my comment. But it seems to me, as I listen in more and more, of course, this paper is taking Africa from the waiting room of history. And as I say, but in doing so, it pushes Africa back into purgatory. It seems that there is something still Africa has to absolve itself of its past sins before it can have any sense of a celebration of a glorious history. But so the question of how is Africa getting out of the waiting room of history by recuperating the complexity of actors and responsibilities differently apportioned to these actors is a question that comes back to how do we understand now 1963 OAU decision? And this is perhaps to phrase differently what Pamela is asking. So is it really a reaffirmation of that tumultuous, historically produced African agency of late 19th century, which is being refarmed by the way the borders are sacrosanct and not to be touched? Or, and even more interestingly, can we read it now as a moment of a decolonial moment, of a subtle decolonial attempt to refuse the legacy of the scramble as received from one way to the other, that is the Europeans to the Africans? And I think there lies a very productive way out for us to re-energize ourselves in terms of how is Africa in its 19th tumultuous century to be understood. Thank you.
Thank you, David. There's a couple of questions from Zaid Sakito. Perhaps in the interest of time, Zaid, I can just read them. They're 2 very succinct ones. One is about the role of the United States in the scramble. Is this simply an Africa-Europe dynamic, or what are the other, does the United States play a role? And secondly, is the concept of terrorism applicable in describing colonial violence and the scramble? And finally, there's a question from Christopher Mohosi, who I believe has just had to leave, but I can just read what he says. He says, I was wondering, given Richard's essay, Are we aiming for a new understanding of partition of Africa, whose boundaries were made, those of nation states, or even much smaller entities whose boundaries were disrupted? Derek's question. How are we, and so this question I think is really crucial for many of us here. How are we to teach the scramble and partition of Africa? What was actually partitioned and by whom? And so I would reemphasize that question, especially of pedagogy and teaching, because our department has been involved in a curriculum review recently, and this has been one of the questions that has really animated our discussions.
Thanks, Edgar. David's question. I'm really sorry. I didn't quite follow what the central question was, David. Would you be able to just quickly restate what question was?
Well, I think the question is just on the charts. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, those. Thank you, David. Sorry about that. Those are some big themes you've raised there. The idea of sending Africa back into purgatory to absolve itself of its past sins. I guess the first thing to ask there, is a question back to your question, is why does Africa need a glorious history? And it seems to me that that's precisely the kind of the problem, in a sense, that it may well be that too much time and energy have been spent on trying to find a clean, glorious, or whatever kind of history that is, to use Terry Ranger's often used phrase, a usable past, rather than trying to kind of deconstruct in a more nuanced way particular dynamics at work in terms of global exchange and understanding global interaction. I'm very struck by the way that you've formulated that question. I'm reminded of Yamba Willigweme, the Malian author, whose novel, title of which escapes me, 1973 or so, where basically he points towards the fact that Africa's history is full of slave traders and people who worked with Europeans and collaborators and so on. This is the moment of kind of post-colonial disillusionment, and you find this actually quite a lot in African literature in the 1970s. And often it's concerned with some kind of imagined past that is going to serve the new nation's purpose. It's full of kind of nice, neat moral lessons and so forth. And I think that's the kind of the question that I'm really posing here is we don't maybe we're looking for the wrong things, I think, in a sense. And the decolonizing agenda that is now commonplace is interesting as far as it goes, but it does focus in on a particular moment in Africa's history, which is, again, what generally happens after the Scramble, during or after the Scramble. And a truly kind of decolonizing approach, I think, to the 19th century would be trying to understand how to understand the long 19th century in its own terms, if that makes sense, rather than simply something that we know leads to, or we imagine leads to, European conquest. So I think it's really a question of trying to get away from that notion that history has to be is either inglorious or glorious, and people are just people, and Africans in the 19th century are no different. I hope that at least gets to some of David's question. The role of the US, just very briefly, it's not been a major concern for this particular project. There is quite a lot increasingly being done actually on the nature of the US's involvement in the continent, particularly in the second half of the 19th century, particularly after the Civil War. It may well be that further work on particular American commercial agents, for example, will throw up some interesting insights, but it's not something I can comment on extensively. But I do know that people, there are one or two people here in Oxford, for example, who are beginning to kind of play with ideas around American involvement in the late 19th century. Is colonial violence terrorism? Yes, I think so. I've recently done a little bit of writing on terrorism in an African context, and I think you can see from a wide range of literature that terrorism is characterized in different ways. There is a bit of a debate within history of terrorism studies whether or not there is such a thing, of course, as state-level terrorism. The consensus now is that there certainly is. States can act in terroristic ways, and this, of course, flows out of the French Revolution, when terror was not just a kind of a moral position or a kind of subjective judgment. Terror was actual policy. That's what the French revolutionary government called it. You know, we're going to terrorize the people. So states that that inflict certain types of violence on their citizens, or in this case their subjects, are absolutely acting in ways that we would describe as terrorism. And certainly when you look at kind of, you know, the attacking of livelihoods and so forth, deliberate targeting of particular groups and their material bases, then that's certainly terrorism in my book. The question about how do we teach the partition is a really good one, and I'd like to be able to say that I have an answer for it. Every year I teach a paper on Africa since 1800, and I try to give more and more attention to the Scramble itself, to the 19th century. So the paper, the course when I inherited it, actually, I think the original version of it began with the Scramble and then moved into the kind of an in-depth look at the 20th century. And I've actually tried to take for 2 or 3 weeks backwards into the end of the slave trade, legitimate commerce, and so forth. So I try to set up the 19th century as a much more of a centerpiece of this course, because of course the way that much modern African history is taught, and there are a few people on this call who will know through their own experiences how the key topics in African history are taught. But the overwhelming focus is on the 20th century. I've tried to contextualize the Scramble as something that happens at the end of a remarkable period of transformation for the continent itself. Of course, at the same time, you then need to bring in European imperial narratives. These are very important. You're almost kind of, for the late 19th century, setting up Europe alongside Africa and looking at how those dynamics interact. And of course, European violence then is inflicted on a number of places. But I try to focus in, I try to make that discussion less about Bismarck and more about Shaka, if I can put it that way. I try to think about, I try to get students to think about the long-term dynamics of African change in the course of the 19th century, both internally driven and through global interaction, to help contextualize the Scramble. Of course, quite separately, there is the issue of the iniquity and the brutality of colonial regimes, and that is dealt with in sort of weeks 3, 4, 5, whatever it might be. But in terms of the Scramble, that's I'm trying year after year to produce a much kind of longer lead-in to what the Scramble actually represents, rather than just thinking about, you know, running through particular kind of sort of textbook factors. Why does the Scramble happen in 1880, late 1870s, early 1880s? But what are the longer term dynamics involved? I have to say it doesn't always work, and sometimes for the sake of convenience, you often revert back to whatever John Iliff says in terms of textbooks, but increasingly that's what I attempt to do.
Well, thank you so much for the presentation and the answers to those questions. It's been, you know, I think generates so many questions that we could continue discussion for a long time. So I also apologize for the lockdown has brought children home from school. So if you can hear the chorus behind me, I apologize. But thank you so much for joining us. Thank you everyone for joining the conversation and attending. We, as I put in the chat there, we have a YouTube page now where we've posted a few lectures, and we'll post this one within the next few days for those who weren't able to join us. And if you're interested in being updated on future events, just send me an email and I'll keep you informed. And yeah, thank you so much. This has been you know, a lot to think with, and I think that last question about teaching has been really really helpful. So I hope that we'll continue these conversations in future, and I hope that next time we can do this in person as well. So.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to everyone. Yeah.